is the DeFi Decoded podcast by 9 Point Partners. The ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast should not be taken as investment advice. Always consult with your financial advisor before investing.
Welcome back to another episode of DeFi Decoded. My name is Andrew Young, and unfortunately my co-host Alex Tapscott cannot be here today, but we have a great guest on today and one of my favorite projects in the space, and so I'm really excited for today's episode. So this week we have Fabian Gompf, who is the CEO of the Web3 Foundation. The Web3 Foundation, which we can get into today, is sort of the foundational arm behind Polkadot, which is one of the largest crypto projects in the world, and also has sort of one of the more important crypto projects and some of the most unique tech being built as well. So really excited. Prior to being the CEO of the Web3 Foundation, Fabian served as the VP at Parity Technologies. He holds a BSc in Electrical Engineering and Business Administration, and while he was at Parity, he played a key role in sort of building the ecosystem for Parity as well as Polkadot. So we're going to be learning lots about the Web3 Foundation as well as the Polkadot network today. And so with that, welcome to the show, Fabian.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So before we sort of dive into the Web3 Foundation, Polkadot, Polkadot ecosystem, all of that, can you just tell us a little bit about sort of your journey in the space, how you got into the crypto world, and more specifically, how you sort of ended up at the Web3 Foundation?
Yeah, totally. So I'm, as you said in your intro, I'm an engineer by background. So I did mostly electrical engineering in my bachelor's, and then I had a bit of a corporate journey, a brief corporate journey, and I think I was mostly looking for something other than that. And we're talking about like the 2016, 2015, 2016 kind of time frame. And so this was the time when like Ethereum was just coming up. At the time got introduced to a bunch of early developers, people involved in the Ethereum Foundation. A lot of them were in Berlin, and I happened to be in Berlin at the time. Through that got introduced to Gavin, who was one of the co-founders of Ethereum and was the CTO back then. Yuta was also a key figure in later in Parity and back then in the Ethereum Foundation. And generally Ethereum had a big developer office in Berlin back then. And out of that group, a company formed. At the time, it was called F-Core. Then later we renamed it to Parity Technologies. And sort of like the name gives it away, like F-Core, we really were primarily building core technology for the Ethereum space. The first product, I guess, we got a little bit of recognition with was a implementation of the Ethereum protocol in Rust. It was called at the time Parity Ethereum. It's still out there, called Open Ethereum now. But at the time, it was powering like a big chunk of the Ethereum network. Spent 6-7 years at Parity. Around 2017, we decided to not just build in the Ethereum space, but we had lots of ideas on how development on blockchains could work and what blockchain protocols might be able to do. So we decided to build our own blockchain. That's what was sort of like Polkadot as an idea came out of. And like I said, spent a bunch of years up until 2020, 2021. Spent my time at Parity, helped build the organization, helped build the technology, and especially in the later years, as you also mentioned, helped build the ecosystem around Polkadot. I left Parity primarily because it was really a sprint to build up this organization and build up this network. Took some time off. It was really a time, there was a lot of momentum behind Polkadot, and I sort of like felt like, okay, this is a good run for me. And a little bit later, I joined the Web3 Foundation, which was sort of like the other key organization in the Polkadot ecosystem. I first joined what's called under Swiss foundation law, the council, really sort of like a board if you look at the traditional company, which is called at the board, so it's kind of like a supervisory and executive strategic decision making. And then from there, I joined as the CEO towards the end of last year. So I'm now, so like 6 to 9 months into the job in the foundation. Yeah, and now we're here.
Perfect. And so what does the Web3 Foundation sort of like, what's its role specifically within the sort of Polkadot ecosystem? And what are the different parts? I think there's part of the foundation, I believe, is focused on, specific projects. Some of it's focused on grants. Some of it's focused on sort of research and education. So yeah, I guess curious, like, what is the Web3 Foundation and what is its role?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so we're, as I just implied, we're based out of Switzerland. We're about 40, 50 people, so pretty lean for a protocol foundation, especially for a protocol of that size. Really the primary leverage that we have is financial assets and know-how. I'd say those are really the two things that we're working with. And then we're primarily a partner-driven organization. So a lot of things in the Polkadot ecosystem aren't necessarily happening in-house in the foundation, but we're sort of like the funders and the stewards behind a lot of the stuff. If you look at the foundation from outside, what are some of the key functions? It's capital deployment. So we make sure funding flows into the right places in the ecosystem. It's research, so especially a lot of the more foundational research, so like where should Polkadot be in 2, 3, 4 years from now? A lot of that thinking is happening in the foundation, and then other developers can sort of like take that, and we specify protocols and so on, and the production development is usually not done in the foundation, but the early research is. And then we do a lot of things sort of like that are related to those two sort of like large things. So we do a lot of education, we do a lot of stewardship and coordination, and we'll do a lot of community building. But all of those things are really targeted at, like I said, leveraging our know-how and leveraging our assets, ultimately for the success of Polkadot. But a lot of the things we're doing have broader implications for the Web3 space, right? Of course, a lot of the research we're doing is ultimately foundational research, and if we solve a problem for Polkadot, that solved problem can be taken in other protocols, and a lot of the community building aspects and so on. We have similar elements where, we're doing it for Polkadot, but we often have this broader view on the whole industry and how other people can do something with it.
So and I guess I probably should have started off with what, for sort of audience members who don't follow crypto as closely as people like we do, or aren't terminally online. What can you explain sort of what Polkadot is? What was the sort of vision behind it? And then we can just go from there.
Yeah, totally. Polkadot is also evolving, so I'm going to sort of like start with as like the baseline Polkadot, and then we can, as we go through the conversation, maybe go into some of the more advanced concepts. But Polkadot ultimately is a blockchain application platform, right? It's a blockchain where you can sort of like build blockchain enabled applications. I think the tech stack sort of like splits into 3 parts. So there's something that we call the Polkadot SDK. It's essentially a toolkit for people to build blockchains. It used to be called Substrate. It's not just used in the Polkadot ecosystem. It's actually used in many other ecosystems as well. It's just a very fast, reliable, easy way to build your own blockchain. Right? And then there's the Polkadot network. This is, everything you're building with the Polkadot SDK is compatible with the Polkadot network. So you can build blockchains that actually plug into the Polkadot network, and you get security and interoperability and so on with it. You can, you don't have to bootstrap your own miner or validator ecosystem. You can tap into the data and the liquidity and the users and so on of all of the other people in that network. That's sort of like the basic idea of sort of like a multi-chain blockchain application platform. And there's a third component, which I'll call so like the Polkadot DAO, Polkadot governance, which is now we have those elements, right? We have a network with lots of different chains that are deployed to it. Currently, it's about 50 or 60 chains that are running on Polkadot, and they all exchange data and they all run applications. Now, how do you sort of like evolve that system in a decentralized way that's still in the spirit of sort of like what we're trying to do with blockchains in the first place? So we lean very heavily into on-chain governance, and sort of Polkadot has a whole system on how it can, almost like a living organism, if you want, sort of like it can evolve itself, it can evolve its own technology, it can make its own funding decisions, and so on, all based on token holder voting. So yeah, happy to jump into any of these things, but I think those are sort of the three key parts that make up Polkadot.
And so where is Polkadot, I guess, today in the broader context of like where the blockchain sort of competitive environment is? Like, I guess what I'm trying to say is, over the last couple of years, I think it was 2018 or 2019 when Polkadot was sort of, first did their token offering, token issue, token event, and the space has changed pretty dramatically. Like back then, it was really just Ethereum was like kind of the only blockchain development platform that was there. Like I guess EOS technically was alive and Tron sort of existed, but back then it was really just Ethereum and that was it. And over the last 5-6 years, the space is completely different now. There's hundreds and hundreds of different chains. We're getting like 5 to 10 new layer 2s on Ethereum. Just new ones per week at this point. And we have sort of alternative ecosystems that have their own apps, their own tokens. Obviously, Solana is sort of the main one, but we're starting to see also the proliferation of like new ecosystems like Move and whatnot. So yeah, I guess I'm just kind of curious, like, where is Polkadot today within this like new environment? I know Polkadot has this Polkadot 2.0 transition as well. So yeah, just really curious to see like what's kind of like the new and updated vision for Polkadot in this kind of like, I guess, newly competitive space.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it makes sense, I think, to look a little bit back, as you also just did, into sort of like the history and then move into where we are today. So yeah, as you said, right, like when we started, there was mostly Ethereum, and Ethereum was also not what it is today. Like Ethereum was one chain, it was a proof of work chain, and the first time it got any attention, so during the 2017 ICO craze, right, it immediately couldn't handle all of those transactions. So like it was pretty nascent technology and environment for blockchain applications. And that's when we came in with a lot of ideas around how to do it differently, and in our view, how to do it better. And if you look at the original Polkadot paper, and you'll be able to find that online. This was published 2016, I think. And you look at how Ethereum rollups look like today, or Avalanche with its subnets, or Cosmos with its zones. I mean, those are all, or Polkadot with its parachains. There's all different names, but ultimately, I think there's a lot of validation for the ideas that we had at the time, which is like, okay, ultimately, if we want to scale blockchains, we have to make it easy to build quite a lot of them, right? And have to be able to connect them to each other and roll them up into each other, right? We weren't calling it rollups at the time, but essentially a parachain is, we call it a cyclical rollup, and we can talk a little bit about the difference with rollups, but it's ultimately chains that all roll up into each other, and have some form of security and or interoperability layer across them. So I think in many ways, Polkadot's model has been very validated by just looking at the space today, because many ecosystems have converged into sort of like similar ideas to how Polkadot 1.0 looked like. Now we have some exceptions to that, I would say. Like you mentioned, Solana. Solana has gone definitely a bit of a different route with a more sort of less of a modular approach of like spinning up a lot of chains and more of a monolithic approach, and that comes with its advantages and disadvantages. But most of the space, I'd say, is like on one side of that spectrum. if you look at now what Polkadot is moving into now, Polkadot is now, we're kind of like refining, like from a vision point of view, we're still going in the same direction, right? So like in the community, in the Polkadot community, we usually talk about Polkadot 2.0 and Polkadot 3.0 as sort of like iterations over Polkadot. And I can speak a little bit about how they look like, but philosophically they stay the same, right? We still want to build, a very secure and scalable environment for blockchains, right? Essentially, a sort of like a roll-up reactor, if you want, right, where you can connect them and have strong security guarantees, and you have tons of technical freedom to build, and you can build all kinds of applications on top of it, and so on. But the way we go about it has, our ideas have, we have more refined ideas, I would say. Yeah. And you mentioned Polkadot 2.0, so those are all of the upgrades that are being rolled out this year. We're kind of like more than halfway through now at this point with the rollouts. Splits into 3 features. I don't want to go into all of these, but it's really a lot about performance. So there's a feature called asynchronous backing. Like this is like getting block time down, getting transactions throughput up. It's those kind of things, right? Like if you have an application that actually has a lot of users, you should not be struggling, or you need fast block inclusion, fast finality. You should not be struggling here. And then the other two features we're rolling out this year are much more around the flexibility of how you can deploy on Polkadot. So they're called agile core time and elastic scaling. And essentially it's the idea that where in the past we sort of like said, okay, you want to deploy on Polkadot, you've built a chain with the Polkadot SDK, you connect it now to Polkadot, and you have there's some resources required for this chain to actually provide, for the Polkadot chain to actually provide those security resources to you. So there's some form of distribution mechanisms that we need, and I think this is something that Polkadot is still highly associated with, which is the parachain auctions. This is something that gathered a lot of momentum in 2020, 2021, because a lot of people participated in these auctions and were backing different chains to be able to actually connect to Polkadot. We're fully moving away from that model. I think it's a model that makes sense if you can only allocate one sort of like, we call it cores, but sort of like one slot to one chain at any given time. But with Polkadot 2.0, we can actually fully abstract over that layer, right? So now you can have chains sharing a core. You can have a chain have multiple cores at the same time, because think about a cloud deployment where if you run your application on AWS and you need more memory, right? You don't think about, oh shit, now I need to buy more computers in like some Amazon data center, right? This is all abstracted away from you. And it's the same thing as what Polkadot is doing, right? If you have a chain that requires significantly more resources now because you have product market fit and you have tons of users and you want to scale, Polkadot allows you to do that completely dynamically. In the same way it allows you to disconnect and to connect and to only use those resources from time to time and so on. So this essentially makes things much easier for both the lower and the higher end, right? Like if you are like an indie hacker kind of guy, like at a hackathon, and you just had a great idea and you would just want to deploy to Polkadot real quick, you can do so, right? You can do so in sort of like a couple of minutes, a couple of hours. And then on the very other side of that spectrum, if you are an enterprise with tons of distribution and you just need tons of users suddenly on this day or over the next coming months, you can also do that, right? So Polkadot has just become significantly more, the barrier to entry has been lowered significantly and it's become significantly more flexible in terms of what it can support. And Polkadot 3.0 is now dubbed Jam. This is a little bit more sort of like future vision kind of stuff. So it's a bit more of a research and development project. If people go on createpaper.com, they'll find technical specifications and teams that are actually implementing this technology now. But this comes back to what I was saying earlier, with the world sort of like split into modular and monolithic at the moment. And we think there's really a very interesting place for roll-up platforms, for platforms that connect chains, that takes the best out of both worlds. And that's what we're trying to do with Jam. So happy to jump more into Jam, but obviously we're getting more into like the nitty gritty of technicals then.
No, I mean, I'm happy to dive into that. I mean, I think like probably the biggest change. So I sort of two things. One is I agree. I think Polkadot was really ahead of its time in terms of enabling people to launch their own parachains. Like that has now become kind of it's almost been superseded in a way with people launching their own rollups and sort of like application specific layer twos, which in a lot of ways is a somewhat similar sort of concept, like having your own sovereignty, but then leveraging sort of a bigger network for security, which is again very similar to like how sort of Polkadot's shared security model was sort of envisioned. But yeah, I'm really curious to hear about Jam, and I guess how do you guys see the space moving forward? In the sense that it seems like increasingly we are moving towards this world of tons and tons of different application specific or thematic rollups, layer twos, app chains. There's been some trouble with Cosmos. Like a lot of people have tried to create their own Cosmos app chains, which has been there's been a lot of trouble there. So yeah, just kind of curious, like what's the Polkadot 3.0 and how does that fit into, I guess, and also how do you guys sort of envision the space playing out over the next couple of years?
Yeah. Let me totally. So let me first say one thing about the sort of like things having converged around similar ideas than what Polkadot had pioneered. So I definitely think that's true. But if you think about some of the places, like especially Ethereum, I think where most of that's happening right now with Ethereum layer twos, it's been more of an emergent strategy, right? It's not so much that Ethereum was built from the ground up to encompass this kind of phenomena, but people started building rollups, and well, you happen to be able to deploy rollups on Ethereum. And like, if Ethereum Foundation had a very different strategy initially, right? Like if you Ethereum 2.0 and so on, like fully sharded system, like the Ethereum roadmap has changed a lot, but what it is right now, it certainly wasn't envisioned sort of like from the start, right? And I think that's a big difference between what you have on Polkadot today and what you have in Ethereum today, where a lot of the problems that Ethereum is now starting to hit with its roll-up infrastructure, we have tried to address from the start, right? Like if you think about L2 interoperability on Ethereum, right? I mean, it's a nightmare. Because you like an optimistic rollup, you have hours or days to actually withdraw something. You don't actually have any standards to move stuff around and so on, right? The same stuff you have with sequencer, like how decentralized are actually a lot of these rollups. So we've tried to address a lot of that stuff from out of the get-go, and I think that's what we're profiting from right now in Polkadot, even as the technology stands today. But another issue, and this is also an issue that we have in Polkadot, and it's certainly an issue that, as you said, that you have in Cosmos, and I think anyone who has gone more heavily into like this modular world of blockchains, is that you have fragmentation, right? Like, okay, you now launch a bunch of chains, and yes, all of these chains can talk to each other, but they talk to each other asynchronously, right? You can't. It's not as nicely as it is on Ethereum main chain, where sort of like everything is in one chain. Everyone has the data sort of like that is on one chain, and sort of like all of the logic that runs on it has just access to that. But instead, you have to make more complicated cross-chain calls, and you fragment your users, you fragment your liquidity, and so on. And I think that's what's really attractive about the more monolithic approach of saying like, well, maybe we can just have one chain that like really scales a lot, right? And so as we move into Polkadot 3.0, that's the kind of stuff that we have an eye on, right? It's like, how do we solve for that piece? That is an issue, I think, across the space, but certainly in Polkadot we've hit quite early, because we were quite early with that model, and have now just a bunch of ideas on how to deal with that. And I said I no need to go too deep into everything here, but if you can allow still for like and this is what we're trying to do with Jam, right? You can still allow for like full compatibility with everything that's there on Polkadot right now. You can still build your own chain with the SDK. You can connect it. Everything can talk to each other. But you can also, well, first of all, you have way more ways to sort of like deploy. There's much more flexibility around it. But you can also have some form of like sort of like semi-coherent state, right? Like when you need it, things can still be in one place. I think that's where a lot of interesting stuff will be unlocked, and that's, Jam is about a lot of things, but it's one of the things that we really have an eye on with Polkadot 3.0 / Jam, is enabling that, because I think that's a key issue with the approach that we have taken, and most other people have taken in the space.
So, shifting gears a little bit, I want to hear a little bit about sort of DeFi on Polkadot. The name of our podcast is DeFi Decoded, after all, though we do talk about, at this point we talk about everything. But I'm just kind of curious, because DeFi on Polkadot never really took off to the same extent that we sort of saw it take off on in the EVM ecosystem. And I'm just kind of curious, partly also that's just, Polkadot has, the ecosystem is sort of more, almost by design, fragmented across different chains. And so there's no kind of like liquidity hub. And again, this is just my speculation, my personal opinion. DeFi requires kind of like a concentration of liquidity. And we were never able to really get like a huge, concentrated DeFi, TVL pools, things like that, things of that nature. At least relative to kind of like how big of the market cap Polkadot is. I'm just kind of curious, like what do you see? I guess like what do you see in the future for DeFi and Polkadot? Is it something you guys are spending a lot of time trying to sort of encourage and incentivize, or I guess I'm just kind of thinking, or just trying to understand, like what's the sort of Web3 Foundation's strategy on DeFi on Polkadot?
Yeah, totally. No, it's a good question. There's a couple of things there. So certainly, traditionally, Polkadot's been always very strong, like with developer community and research and sort of like technical innovations. That's really where the stronghold is, right? For Polkadot traditionally. But certainly, since I've joined, we've gotten significantly more serious on some of the other aspects, right? I always say, like, we've been very good at figuring out the hard part, and then sometimes not so good at figuring out some of the easier parts. DeFi, I think, there's sort of like a question, like, to what extent, what makes DeFi an interesting use case, right? And I think there's two levels to what makes it interesting. One is, you can have all kinds of like more advanced financial instruments and actually put them in code and actually have people use those, right? It's sort of like on a higher level. But I think on the lower level, there's actually a more foundational one, which is, ultimately, blockchains will always have tokens flowing around, right? And a lot of the applications are economically permissioned. And even if you have a game, right, and technically not in the vertical of DeFi, you will still need to probably have stable coins to buy the assets. And maybe you have to have a native token to somehow engage with it. And you have to swap into that native token. So therefore you need a DEX and so on. So you already need stable coins and DEX. So you have to have all of this sort of like plumbing, right? DeFi plumbing for a lot of the higher level use cases, even if those higher level use cases are not necessarily DeFi. And so I think this is the piece where we are, at the moment quite focused on. And to your point of like, there's not been a central hub. Traditionally, there has not been. There's now a chain in Polkadot called Asset Hub. It's sort of like a system chain, if you want. Where a lot of those efforts are concentrated on. There's liquidity incentives that are running. There's a much greater focus on and off ramps and stablecoin integrations and so on. So I definitely agree with your statement, sort of like traditionally, but really over the last month, there's been a much greater focus on a lot of those things. Whether you believe in, or you not necessarily believe, whether you want to focus on sort of like the higher level use cases of DeFi or not, I think it's very important for the base layer stuff in any case. I think it's actually, starting to be a pretty nice place for DeFi on Polkadot. But that was not the case 2-3 years ago.
Yeah, for sure. And talking a little bit more about kind of, like, we don't have to talk too much about sort of the Polkadot token itself, but one of the big drivers for sort of tokenomics, value accrual for the token was, this idea of like parachain auctions, you had to essentially lock up DOT tokens in order to buy slots, but essentially in order to sort of launch your own parachains and whatnot. I'm kind of curious. My understanding is that that's sort of been the focus has sort of shifted away from that strategy around sort of parachain auctions as like the main sort of, I guess, value accrual or tokenomics aspect of the DOT token. Again, correct me if I'm wrong there. And then also too is what role does the sort of DOT token play within the broader Polkadot ecosystem? Is it it's a staking token? Is it shared security? I guess I'm just kind of curious. What sort of functionality does it play both now and more in the future as well?
Yeah, totally. There's a couple of elements. So if you look at a high level, like what can you do on the protocol side with the DOT token? And I think this is also something where Polkadot has been traditionally quite strong in. You can actually use the token for quite a lot of things, like just baseline in the network. So one is governance. So I was earlier referring to the Polkadot DAO that sort of like is there to for Polkadot to evolve itself. If you own a DOT token, you can vote on pretty much everything in Polkadot, right? You can vote on what this on-chain treasury is spending money on. You can vote on how the inflation parameters look like. You can vote on what kind of code changes will happen in the system, right? Like how the features actually evolve in the system. You can vote on what kind of ambassadors represent the network and so on. It's a pretty sophisticated sort of like governance system, and all of that works on the basis of voting, and not just voting but conviction voting, right? So you can vote. You can sort of like multiply your conviction, right? How badly you want your vote to count by locking that token up. And this has been so there's significant parts of the DOT supply are just locked up by people with skin in the game who say, hey, we want the network to take a certain direction. So that's a big use case of the DOT token. A second use case, you already mentioned it, is staking. So it's essentially in the security of the network. While again, I think we pioneered a lot of this stuff, proof of stake is now something that's quite common in the industry. Not something I think we have to talk maybe too much about it, but ultimately, you can run a validator, put some dots down, lock them up, and secure the network through that, and then get rewards in DOT again for that. But also, if you don't want to run all that infrastructure, you can just nominate other people in the network to do that for you. So if you're a DOT holder, you can very easily get sort of like rewarded for locking up your token and supporting other people to validate in the network for you. That's the second use case. And the third use case relates to what you were saying. So previously, still the case, but probably by the time this podcast comes out, I think it's supposed to roll out like any minute now. We're sort of like getting rid of this parachain auction model, but previously it was parachain auctions. So you could lock up your token and sort of like vote essentially for different parachains to be connected. There's still, we're still using the token for how we distribute the cores, the slots for parachains on the network. But instead of doing it through parachain auctions, you essentially buy what we call core time. So you buy time on a certain kind of core, right? And the dots you spend on that get burned. So it's actually now a deflationary model for Polkadot. The more the system is used, the more core time is being used, the more that deflationary mechanism comes to play. And then there's probably another thing that I haven't mentioned in here that is sort of related to this governance model that I was saying, but maybe a high level, is the whole DOT economy around who's being paid for what in Polkadot is also denominated in DOT, right? So the on-chain treasury, right? Like this sort of like on-chain DAO that Polkadot can do sort of like common good things with, all of that is in DOT. There's lots of people who actually work for the Polkadot network rather than working for like individual organizations. So we have a technical fellowship, we have like head ambassadors and so on, right? Like really people who take on roles for a blockchain rather than for a company. All of that is sort of like done in DOT. And then the last thing I would mention is because DOT is such a high market cap, high volume asset, and it's used across sort of like all of these protocol functions that I was just describing, it's of course also used in a lot of the logic of things that are built on top of Polkadot, right? So many of the applications use sort of like DOT as sort of like the main asset to do things in Polkadot. And if anything, we've seen an increase, or we've seen sort of like a trend for this to increase. So like more and more parachains, rather than having their own token, having DOT as the underlying asset that powers whatever application they have been building. So yeah, that's a bit of a rundown on like all of the things you can do with DOTs, but that's most of it, I think.
Awesome. And then I guess one last question before you go. We sort of ask every guest this, but how do you see, like I would say crypto right now is at an interesting inflection point. Sentiment is probably, it's pretty low, I would say, even though the price of Bitcoin has been coming back up. But sort of besides Bitcoin and Solana and a couple of meme coins, everything from like a market wise has been kind of getting crushed. And so I guess I'm just kind of curious, what are you most excited about over the next 12 to 18 months, both from sort of a technical perspective, but then also just like individually within, if there's any sort of sectors within the crypto economy that you're particularly excited about? Like I'd say like right now people are excited about prediction markets because, we have the US election coming up in 2 months, but I'm just kind of curious, what are the big things you're excited about, big narratives, sectors, and what gets you excited?
Yeah, totally. So I would say, I mean, I definitely agree with your statement that we're at a low point, at least in terms of sentiment. I've seen it like long enough now that I would say, sentiment tends to be a lagging indicator. Things have to, the people in the industry, the people who work on stuff usually realize much earlier that things are not going the way they should be going than, the people on the internet complaining or whoever, sort of is driving sentiment. So, if I think about where the space is right now in terms of actuals, and I mean, I can, sort of like take the lens that I'm most familiar with Polkadot. Like Polkadot has never been more scalable, easier to use. It has never more transaction volume than it has today. Like it's used much more than it's ever been used, even when the price was higher. It's the infrastructure is way more built out, and I'm sure a lot of these things, like the UX is way better. Like I'm sure that's true for like many other ecosystems as well, right? So this is a little bit what I mean with lagging indicator. I think eventually we will see sort of like those fundamentals build up enough to have another uptrend in the industry. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is like the space is very narrative driven, right? We had 2017 like ICO craze, and we had like and then everyone thought in 2018 like the world is ending, and then we had like 2020, 21 like DeFi summer. We had the NFT craze, and everyone thought like everyone's gonna own NFTs, and these things are gonna be like a Picasso or whatever, right? We're kind of like overshooting with like excitement, right? But then what is left, right, still tends to be an interesting core idea, right? Like I think, NFTs are still an interesting core idea. DeFi is still a very interesting core idea. And money of these things more than just a core idea. And I think we have a lot of this, we have the same thing, I think, with blockchain gaming, right? Like maybe it's not, all of this like, play to earn or whatever, but having aspects of a game mapped onto some blockchain might still be a very, very interesting idea, right? And so just because some of these narratives have not played out immediately the way people were hoping doesn't mean they're not extremely interesting. To your second question, I guess what I'm most excited about, I think the thing that has the highest chance of building the foundation of another uptrend for the industry is what I would call sort of like further integration with traditional tech and finance. So we've seen, launch of Bitcoin ETFs, launch of Ethereum ETF. We see the rise of stable coins. We generally see much more integration with sort of like payment solutions and so on for blockchains. So I think there's just a push towards being more integrated into systems that already have distribution, right? And I think there's just there's a very high chance that if the space is going anywhere, that a lot of the value is going to lie there rather than being sort of like recreated completely in isolation in the blockchain industry. So yeah, anyways, if I make one prediction, it would be that's where a lot of the value is coming from.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Fabian. It's been great to have you on the podcast today, and I'm really excited for everything in the Polkadot ecosystem. And Polkadot 3.0, I think, is going to be huge. I mean, Polkadot is one of the biggest crypto projects in the world, but it still feels like it's kind of relatively underrated and sort of underappreciated, at least in sort of the Western world. I know it's obviously got a huge presence in Asia, but so yeah, I'm really excited for sort of a breakout for the narrative to switch to Polkadot. I think it's a long time coming and definitely sort of deserved. So it was really great to have you on the podcast. And where can our audience members sort of track Polkadot as well as yourself? You have a Twitter account?
Yeah, totally. I mean, Polkadot on X, like just at Polkadot, Polkadot.com. We just launched a new website, so definitely those are two places. I'm also on X at Fabian Gompf, so it's just my first name, my last name. Yeah, those are great places to follow the conversation. Awesome.
Well, thanks a lot, Fabian, and look forward to having you back on the podcast soon.
Cool. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
The information contained herein does not constitute an offer or solicitation by anyone in the United States or in any other jurisdiction in which such an offer or solicitation is not authorized, or to any person to whom it is unlawful to make such an offer or solicitation. Prospective investors who are not residents in Canada should contact their financial advisor to determine whether securities of the funds may be lawfully sold in their jurisdiction.